Folks, I think I'll begin. You had Everette, and 2004, one of the ladies in my United Daughters of Confederacy group, this medal's from that group. I've been a member 27 years, and my DAR member 63 years. But she came to one of our meetings, and she handed me three sheets from the Veterans History Field Kit. And basically it was a veterans release form, a biographical data form, which included the veteran's name, where he or she served, the battles, the medals, and special commendation, was he or she a prisoner of war, etc. There was a veterans release form and an interviewer's release form. And she asked, does anybody know any World War II veterans? Well, I said, yeah. I know 5 or 6 from the Retired Officers Association and Navy League. And so she handed me three sheets. I went home and I contacted 5 veterans, set up interview times for them, and it escalated in 2004 when I started to 2014 when I ended, and I had interviewed 117. And I spent almost 10 years full-time volunteer work interviewing veterans morning and afternoon. And I went through 36 reams of paper and 2 printers. and our computer, I learned to use a computer. My first 36 interviews were handwritten and hand-carried to the Library of Congress. But this is basically how I started, and it kept escalating, and someone would say, well, do you know this person? No. Do you know that person? No. And I put signs up in assisted living complexes, and a lot of it was from word of mouth or referral. And I interviewed, as I said, 117. I've turned 2 down this year. I'm not able to interview anymore, but I will assist and help if anyone wants to do it. And you can receive forms. On this desk there is a folder of all the veterans who I interviewed, and on the back there's a notebook of all the interviews. So please check it out, look at some of them. You may know people who are in them and pass them along. And I'll start with the first gentleman who I interviewed, who was a member of our church, and his name was Ted Cruz. Okay, I have compiled 7 volumes of interviews. They're like this. And the first set was sent to the Library of Congress. If the interview person wanted a copy, I made copies for them. Each person received a thank you note, and some of them sent thank you notes to me. I'll share one thank you note. Dear Bill, thank you for sharing your history and World War II experiences. Your personal commitment, defense of our homeland, courage, and sacrifices helped the United States defeat tyranny on 3 fronts. Freedom is not free. When you answered our country's call, you helped America achieve it. Your stories will educate future generations and will not be forgotten. Along with this interview, they will be mailed to the Veterans History Project coordinator at the Library of Congress in December 2007. Okay, the first interview was Theodore Cruz, and I'll take turns sitting and standing if it's okay with you. Seated in an indigo blue crushed velvet recliner was my dear friend Theodore Cruz. Ted, as he liked to be addressed, wore glasses and had receding gray hair. He wore maroon slacks, a 2-tone blue-gray and striped sweater, and a black cardigan.
Thank you, sir.
A parakeet chirped from Marie Rose's kitchen. We were both a little nervous as he was my first interview, and on behalf of the United Daughters of Confederacy. With a gentle smile and his quiet voice, this unassuming man began. And when I started mine, I interviewed what they were wearing because you had to include colored pictures and biographical data, and etc. And I thought, well, if they ever lost the picture, they could find it by what the veteran, she or he was wearing. He began, my parents were Danish. My last name is spelled with an E, not a U. Neva, my mother was a great cook. My dad, William, served in the Great War in the World War I era. He died when I was very young. He is buried in the Presidio. I was born in Oakland, an only child and went to school. Many happy memories were spent at the Orpheum Theater. My mother played their wonderful Wurlitzer pipe organ for all matinees and movies. I often sat beside her, cleaned the aisles, and watched these movies. All my life, I have loved musicals, Broadway shows, and especially big band music. I have dozens of organ music tapes. After our interview, he gave me a patriotic tape of Sousa's Grand Marches. I graduated from school, he said, and worked at the Orpheum Theater. I remember we were all shocked when Pearl Harbor was bombed. All those poor guys died for no reason. I joined the Army November 11, 1942, like my dad had. And I eventually made corporal. I don't remember too much about basic training. I think it was at Fort Ord in California. And we did all the usual things. We drilled and practiced and marched and marched and marched. I'll never forget my landing when we flew home, though, he laughed. Do you remember where I landed, he asked Marie. She said it was somewhere north of Sacramento. Well, I was in the head. And I hit my head on the ceiling when we landed and was badly bruised and had a horrible bad cut. The plane's wheels didn't lower and we bounce landed. It was pretty tough. You want to know about my service? Okay. Well, I don't remember my serial number, but the VA probably has it, and they did. Our group was sent to Calcutta, India, and we stayed until the end of the war, so he was basically in the India-Burma campaign. I'll never forget how hot it was. We left California in the winter, and it was 60 degrees highest, and arrived in India where it was 100 to 125. You think it's hot here. Our clothes stuck to us, and we sweat all the time. The first couple of us waded, swam, and drank some of that Ganges River trying to cool off. Was that a mistake? A couple days later, our sergeant told us never ever to go near the Ganges or swim in it because it was too polluted and dangerous. It would make us sick. It did. We already were. Ever since, I've had skin problems and diseases throughout my life. And he was afraid to go out in public with sleeveless shirts because he did have skin diseases from swimming in the Ganges. My VA disability is based on it. They keep lowering the amount, though. I do not like to look in a mirror every day, and I'm ashamed of my body. Sometimes I don't want anybody to see me. Since I had office experience, I was assigned as clerk typist, where we worked with many British and Indians who I liked and enjoyed. Men lived in hundreds of tents the entire time we were there, and we walked in mud during the monsoons. At nights we slept on cots covered with mosquito nets and had to take medicine to prevent malaria. Fortunately, I never caught it. When the Army found out I had theater experience, they put me in charge of all the USO shows. I organized the tours for soldiers and really liked meeting all of the performers. Especially I liked Bob Hope. And I met him several times. Red Skelton and the Andrews sisters were wonderful. Jimmy DeRossi and his brother Tommy came separately as they didn't get along. Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, was a really nice lady. Sometimes we left camp and went into Calcutta. People slept on sidewalks. We went into Calcutta. People slept on sidewalks and most wore rags. They begged and cows were everywhere and people starved. There's another chair over here at this end.
Thank you.
Or over there?
Yeah.
I'll sit over here too.
Sit anywhere where there's room.
Sure, you betcha.
Okay.
Wherever.
That's okay.
Thank you.
I hated all the mud and the heat and the monsoons, and especially the heat. When General Stilwell and General Patton arrived, I was still there. but I never went into Burma where many of the soldiers were. I was happy where we were, and then finally the bomb was dropped in Japan. It's a shame so many died, but it ended the war. 6 months after VE Day, I left for the United States. He chuckled. I've never forgotten my arrival, and then he repeated it. March 6, 1946, I was honorably discharged at Camp Beale, California. It was great to be in a dry place, not muddy, in a cool, not a hot climate. I learned a lot in the Army. I did my best, and I was proud to serve my country. Ted and his wife never had children. For many years he was employed by the American Title Company in Concord and was a member of the Oddfellows Lodge. 16 years ago I met this gentle, kind man at Concordia Lutheran Church. He loved his dogs and his many friends. A devoted Christian, he ushered at church, loved his neighbors and dear friend Marie. Never once did I hear him curse or speak negatively about anyone. He was hugged, thanked for his service, and was presented with a small American flag. And he was my first interview. The second one, I'll alternate with women and men who lived in Concord. This lady's name is Ruth Marie Esseltine. Some of you may know her. A California high school student, Ruth was a 10th grader when all students were assembled by the principal. He announced that Pearl Harbor had been bombed by the Japanese. Everyone was shocked. Her dad was a Richmond shipyard inspector and immediately started working in war production. She recalled practice air raid drills at school and placing sheets on the windows so lights wouldn't show. December 12th was my sister's birthday, and we were afraid to celebrate. At times we were petrified. Tanks, jeeps, and military trucks were on all of our roads. Guys were enlisting and going off to serve their country. Rationing was instituted. Eventually our fear left and we returned to normal everyday activities. In high school, for the war effort, I helped the Red Cross make bandages and knitted in my spare time. Classmates and I enjoyed football games and dances. My sister worked for the Oakland Tribune newspaper. Many Japanese owned nurseries, and after the bombing, most businesses required cash up front on their purchases. And I read in the paper yesterday, Target's doing the same thing. Okay, in Concord's Four Corners, where we lived, there was a farm, and on it we raised cows, chickens, turkeys, and had a large garden. The barter system was used for sugar and shoes and clothing. Because we had a farm, we had gas for our tractor, so we were lucky. Butane was delivered for heat. There was a copper shortage, so Coleman lanterns were used for light. Gravity flow supplied water. We worked 7 days a week on our farm. My senior year, I drove a 1937 Hudson to work after school and on weekends. It had suicide doors, which had to be pried open. At the Army's Benicia Arsenal, I worked on link loading and built bullets for 50 caliber machine guns. There were 2 blacks, 2 greens, 1 tracer. G was the incendiary. Guns were placed in wooden boxes, which we soldered shut. These were sent by ships overseas. My girlfriends and I in dresses sat on these boxes, and we ate lunch surrounded by them in warehouses. Coveralls and headscarves were worn when working in the ordnance department. Okay, we sat on these boxes and ate lunch surrounded by them in the warehouse. Coveralls and headscarves were worn when working in the ordnance department. I counted warehouse parts, inventoried bins, and became an inspector. I helped rewrite the Army Parts Nomenclature Manual. After graduation, I was hired as a bookkeeper clerk, DAF4. I was young, I loved my job, and went to dances and picnics with girlfriends. We were chaperoned wherever we went. The Masonic Hall was our favorite place. Okay, my favorite songs were I'll Be Seeing You, Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree, and one I was listening to on the way over here today was The White Cliffs of Dover. You can understand those words. Those beautiful songs really bring back memories. Once I even danced with Cesar Romero after my girlfriends dared me to ask him. He was very handsome in his Navy uniform, and I have a picture with him and me. When the Army closed the arsenal, I applied for and was accepted at the U.S. Naval magazine, Port Chicago, Concord. My brother told us he was going to their theater that night. To me, it was known as Hicksville, as the population was only 1,200. July 17, 1944, an explosion occurred which broke all of our dishes. We thought there'd been an earthquake, except for the loud noise. The entire sky lit up. We drove to Port Chicago, but the guards wouldn't let us enter that area. We were terrified as we thought my brother had died when the theater blew up. Later that day, he came home. My parents didn't know whether to be relieved or spank him. He'd already seen the movie, so he'd gone to Martinez instead. And he'd seen a different movie with a friend. It saved his life. My sister, who was working in the San Diego Tribune, called, but all the phone lines were down. Since she couldn't call us, she called the closest restaurant nearby. The folks came to get us. We called her and told her that nobody was hurt. For years, though, farmers plowed up missiles and ordnance in their fields. The explosion moved an entire wall of the warehouse. I worked in Port Chicago, and it was nearly demolished and off limits to all civilians. I handled papers for 340 men who'd been killed. My boss found a missile under his chair. Thankfully, it hadn't exploded. The town was demolished as it was too close to the ship's piers. I had a picture of all 6 ammunition ships at the Naval Weapons Station, and now the Concord Historical Society has it. Okay. Anyway, we returned home. The only memento I have is a glass knob from the school that I attended in Port Chicago. Later on, my 18-year-old brother joined the Merchant Marines, although he couldn't swim. He saw lots of actions at sea. About this time, the war was winding down. Hiroshima was bombed, and it was a good thing as it saved our lives on both sides. Okay, we were cheered and exalted when it ended. It was an end to something horrible, and our guys finally returned home. My family drove to San Diego and visited my sister. I saved all those pictures and papers of the Nuremberg trials. The war changed women's lives. The armed forces were unified. Women's attitudes changed. They worked different jobs that were formerly men's, and they did it capably. When they returned home, vets were given preferences, and we ladies had a difficult time returning as housewives only. They had a different perspective on family life. We learned how to get along with different department heads, and we weren't working as nurses or teachers only. Things were better and jobs were different for women. We contributed to our country and we're proud. Okay. How many veterans are in this audience? Thank you for your service. Chuck, you too. Okay, thank you. How many veterans' wives are in the audience? Thank you too. I think we deserve a thank you as well. Yeah, it's just. I know my husband he was on the battleship Wisconsin 1 year as a midshipman. He was on 2 destroyers, the Hopewell and the, I forgot it, DDE 1025 Bauer. And then he was on 3 nuclear submarines and then worked with the Washington, D.C., was assigned 9 years to as project manager of the Poseidon, the Trident missile program in D.C. And he also was, he conferred with Johns Hopkins physics labs and designed a satellite and saw it launched in space. So he left a wonderful legacy too. Really proud of him. Unfortunately, he died 4 years ago from Alzheimer's. Okay. So another lady's, well, maybe I'll share it, I'll alternate. This gentleman's name is Charles Verveline, and he was a submariner, World War II. A beautifully landscaped lawn, trimmed rose bushes, and a towering royal palm tree were in Charles's front yard. Inside his immaculate home, he boasted about his newly remodeled kitchen. Then he shared Navy service materials that were placed on his kitchen table. Attired in a black shirt and gray slacks, he wore glasses. Hairline had receded, and glasses reflected the sunlight outside. The VHP program was explained and began. One of 11 children, 2 died in childbirth. I was born on a farm in New York, October 24, 1921. My mom Florence was a great cook. Her chicken and dumplings, yum. And her ham and dumplings were my favorite meals. She canned almost everything we grew, yet we barely survived. We finally had to move into Biggingham, New York for 2 years. In 1932, we moved to a small farm in Dundee, New York, and I started 6th grade. We owned cows, chickens, pigs, and grew all of our food on the small farm. Dad worked at a gas plant. I mowed lawns and picked berries. My sisters worked at a restaurant for 10 cents an hour. Sophomore year, I left school to support my family. I joined the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. My dad was in that as well. And he helped build Hoover Dam, Boulder Dam, Roosevelt Dam, and met my mom at Grand Coulee Dam. Okay, for 6 months. I earned $30 a month and sent $22 home monthly. I returned to school but left after, I wonder if we could turn them. This is what I received from the Library of Congress. This is Ordinary Veterans, Extraordinary Stories. Okay, hey, that's a good idea. You want to share? Okay. Okay, he took, I returned to school, left after my junior year. I joined the United States Navy in New York in 1940 and took boot camp training at Newport, Rhode Island. Afterwards, our company crossed the United States.
That's all I have to do.
By train.
Sure.
Thank you.
Should I leave the door open?
No,
Let
no, no.
Well, maybe for a while, if it gets noisy, we'll close it again.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, people were
I'll go to over there and tell them to keep the music
down. Thank you for your help.
You're welcome.
Okay. Here we go again. Okay, 1940, boot camp training at Newport, Rhode Island. Oh, that's better. Our company crossed the United States by train, and we were assigned to the USS Maryland, stationed at Long Beach, California.
It's a little too loud, yeah.
January 1941, the Pacific Fleet was transferred to Hawaiian territory. I was assigned to GA Division. My battle station was the forward mast, 50 caliber gun mount. In Pearl, I saw submarines going out to sea. My best friend Wesley was stationed, who was from Pennsylvania, and I put in for submarine duty. The Maryland left Pearl, May 1941, for a 6-month overhaul in Bremerton. Are you all able to hear me in the back? Okay, thank you. May 1941, in the middle of gunnery school, we both received orders to sub-school, New London, Connecticut. There we trained on O&R boats, and upon completion I was assigned to diesel school. Afterwards I was ordered to the USS Gudgeon, SS-211, stationed at Mare Island, Vallejo, California. She was brand new, just commissioned. Clarence Byers, my friend, and I hitchhiked from New London, Connecticut to his home in Phoenix, Arizona, then took a bus to California. Upon arrival, we discovered the Gudgeon was on shakedown cruise to Alaska and then to Pearl in Hawaiian territory. Byers and I were transferred to the USS Peleus for transportation to Hawaii. September 40, 1941, we arrived, and I boarded the Gudgeon, captained by Lieutenant Commander Greenfield, known to the force as Jumpin' Joe. Daily, we trained on this new boat and crew. December 3rd or 4th, we left Pearl, and were training in Lahaina Roads, Maui. Anchored off island, we just finished breakfast and were listening to Hawaiian music. It was interrupted, though, by the following words. We interrupt this program as the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. Everyone looked at each other in belief, stunned belief, and we said, bull. Then the captain announced over the PA system, general orders, general orders, general quarters, general quarters. This is no drill. The Japs have attacked Pearl Harbor, make preparations for getting underway. Torpedoes were armed. We got underway, dove and patrolled north of Hawaii. December 8th, we pulled into Pearl and passed Battleship Row, where I used to be on the USS Maryland. She was sunk at the bow. I saw the USS Oklahoma turned over and the USS Arizona still burning. Destruction was everywhere. The air was thick with smoke, the harbor black with oil, solid oil. Bodies and body parts were floating on the water. Ships were still smoking and burning. No one said a word. We tied up at subbase. The captain and XO went ashore first. When they returned, we were allowed to leave. Ashore, bodies were piled everywhere. Men groaned and moaned and were terribly burned and injured. Many cried in pain. The stench was terrible. They were being taken care of as soon as possible, though, by the military. The next 2 days, torpedoes and food were loaded aboard. Food was stored in every nook and cranny in the boat and almost filled the passageways. Food was stacked from one end of that submarine to the other. They do it that way now, too. Food was alongside the engines, in the bulkheads, under the bunks. December 11th, 1941, USS Gudgeon departed for Japan. USS Polak accompanied us, but later returned to base because of an after battery hatch leak. Orders were received to the USS Gudgeon to patrol off Japan. 15 days later, we sank a freighter, and on the return trip, we sank a Jap submarine. We were the first sub in history to sink an enemy combat ship. The crew had R&R and celebrated at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel for 2 weeks. Then we returned to sea. And on our second patrol off Saipan, USS Gudgeon sank 2 ships, a large freighter, another sub, and returned to Pearl. The crew enjoyed R&R for 2 more weeks at the Royal Hawaiian. There's a blue booklet up there. One of the gentlemen I will speak about later, John Chapman, was a lifeguard at the the Royal Hawaiian and was on the USS West Virginia when she took 9 torpedo hits. And he returned 3 years ago and was the Grand Marshal of the parade in Honolulu. And he went to the Royal Hawaiian and said, well, I was supposed to work that day, but unfortunately my ship was bombed. And they gave him that blue booklet on the Royal Hawaiian, or that pink booklet, yeah. Okay, on my second patrol we left, let's see, at the Battle of Midway, we didn't engage in action. We were ordered to Australia, we patrolled off Truk, sank 3 transports and another freighter. Next we went to Fremantle in Western Australia. After 2 weeks R&R there, I was transferred to the tender USS Peleus. For a short time in Austria, I dated 3 women at the same time and met my future wife, Gwendoline. I was then assigned to the USS Grenadier. We left on her second patrol, her 5th, aboard the Grenadier on March 21st, 43 to patrol the Malaccan Straits. April 20th, we fired at a Japanese ship, but missed. The next morning, a dive bomber attacked. We dove, but a bomb hit us near the maneuvering room next to the torpedo room. The bomb knocked me flat on my back. Lights and power failed, and we were sinking. Our boat was on fire, and the men tried to put it out. Another man and I put on respirators and extinguished it. Smoke was everywhere, and it had no place to go on that boat. Because of the angle, seawater seeped in and could be heard flooding us. I prayed, God help us, please. And those were like floating coffins. If you've ever been on any of the older submarines. There's one down in San Francisco, and everything's gray. It's depressing, and it's crowded, and they had to surface every 2 hours to recharge the batteries. Anyway, they're sinking, and he says, God help us, please. We hit bottom at 278 feet. The crew bailed out water constantly from the motor room to the forward torpedo room. We were down 14 hours. The captain informed us we had 2 chances. Either we escaped using the Monson lung, or we surfaced. We blew the ballast tanks to lighten her. You could hear air screeching into those tanks, and nothing happened. The seconds ticked away, the minutes ticked away, and we waited and we waited. Everyone watched the deep gauge needle, and we silently prayed. Pretty soon, the needle wiggled. Then it read 270 feet, 265, 260, 250, until we soon surfaced. The stern was down because we were flooded. We got all 4 main engines started but couldn't make a knot. The shaft froze because it was bent and electrical fires started again. I was the fuel king, or I was the one who pumped oil all night long. I was so damn tired and I hadn't slept for 2 days. No one had. It was dark when we surfaced, and we were able to inspect the damage and clear the smoke. The propulsion system was not repairable. Captain Fitzgerald ordered us to rig a small sail, and we sewed it together from the officers' bunk bed sheets. But that effort failed because the wind didn't blow. In the distance was an island, but we didn't get there. A Jap bomber flew overhead the next morning. It tipped toward us and saw the white sail. He probably thought it was our surrender. I fired a shot in the war that day. I had a bar rifle, had a magazine, and I fired every damn clip at that. Anyway, our gunner's mate fired a 22 millimeter gun at the plane and finally hit it. But a bomb dropped nearby. 2 Japanese ships approached in the distance. The captain told us they wanted to capture the submarine, but we wouldn't let them. He decided to scuttle it. We shot holes in the coating engines and machines and then sunk them separately. All confidential materials and secret papers were burned. Then we jumped overboard. The chief of the boat and the captain stayed aboard. They opened all the vents and the sub started sinking. They abandoned ship, and we watched her sink. The last thing we saw was her bow pointing toward the heavens. It was a hell of a sorry thing to see. He sighed, glanced down, and then resumed. It took a Japanese merchant ship over an hour to pick up 68 enlisted men and 8 officers. On deck, they fed us some hardtack, something left over from World War I imagine. Honest to God, you couldn't even bite through it. All I had on were sandals and dungarees because the sub had been so hot inside. The following morning, we pulled into a port named Penang in the Malay Peninsula. When we arrived, they grabbed, blindfolded, and trucked us to a Navy base, which had previously been a convent. Officers were taken upstairs and we were taken downstairs. The captain was questioned first. They nearly beat that poor man to death. He was black and blue and green the next day when they threw him down the stairs. For 4 days we were questioned and not given any food or water. The 5th day they finally gave us a sip of water. Every time you stood, you blacked out and fell because of weakness. Although we were questioned, beaten, and starved, and tortured, they got no military information from our crew. Finally, they gave us some watery rice, which we found out was the best thing they could have given us in our weakened condition. It tasted good, really good. Before we left the convent, we signed our John Henrys on the walls. I didn't have time to carve my last name in the wall before we left. And he shared a picture of that wall taken after the war with me. When whitewash was removed years and years later, crew names were visible. Nuns contacted the American Navy and discovered the USS Grenadier crew had been prisoners there. I still send those poor sisters $100 a year. The nurse in charge wrote that the amount is 2/3 of her yearly earnings, and nuns regard it today as a shrine. The crew was separated and sent from camp to camp. The captain and XO first-class radio men were flown to Japan. Unloaded on a transport, we were sent to Singapore for 2 weeks. Hundreds of British and Australian men died there. They're having a big reunion there this year, but I was only there a short time. One of our crew had malaria, so stayed behind. He was too sick to leave. The rest of us left that poor guy alone. It affected him. He became a loner, never straightened out, and never got over the war. We left Singapore on the transport Osama Maru for Japan. During this trip, American submarines sunk several ships in our convoy. How would you like to be in the bottom of a ship locked in these rooms? There was no way of getting out, and we could hear American torpedoes going off. We could see everything that was going on in those subs as they fired at our convoy. You're thinking, oh my God, you could see the old man bending over the periscope saying, "Stand by to fire, fire." We prayed we wouldn't be killed. The Osama Maru was one of the fastest ships built, as it could make 30 knots, and could probably outrun any of our ships. After the attack, a Japanese warrant officer and 3 of his guards came down and let us have it. They knocked us around, yelled, but we couldn't understand a word they said. Our subs must have torpedoed a bunch of their ships. They made us line up, bend over, and hold on to this railing. They had wooden clubs as big as baseball bats. Everybody was hit twice, except for one guy, short, stocky, and strong, who took 1 hit. He had 2 years of college at Southern Cal. They kicked him in the head, stomach, and back. I didn't want to be hit in the spine in case they broke my back, so I twisted and raised up so the club would hit my lower hip and legs. Legs were numb and I fell over, and I still limp to this day. And I still have pain in my hip and left leg from that beating. Guards screamed, "Tat, tat, tat, tat," which means get up, I later learned. My legs quivered and I couldn't move. What was difficult was watching and hearing my injured shipmates being beaten as the line got smaller and smaller. Guys awaited their turns and dreaded it. We moaned, groaned, and whimpered from excruciating pain. Finally, they left us alone. Tears streamed down faces. Those had been kicked in the ribs and stomachs, couldn't move and had to be carried. The Japs were mean, vicious, and brutal. On shore, we boarded a train to Kokura, the place they should have dropped the atomic bomb, but because of fog, they flew to Nagasaki instead. They placed us in an old Japanese prison next to the old steel mill called Taikon. There they built a new camp for us toward the town of Tabaka, next to the largest power plant in that area. They painted red crosses on rooftops so Americans wouldn't bomb us. We only had 1 day off a year, and that was Christmas. Excuse me, each day was the same. Awakened at 5 a.m., we washed in cold water or didn't. It was freezing, 20 below outside and 30 below inside. We ate our daily cup of rice for breakfast and fell in for muster, then lined up for work detail. We marched 1 mile to the railroad siding, and we boarded flat cars for the train ride to Yawata Steel Mill. Often as we passed beneath bridges, children stoned us and threw rocks at us. Finally, one day they hit a guard. The next day, the stoning stopped. The train ride took 45 minutes to the factory. It was hot in the summer and DAMN cold in the winter. Prisoners were assigned different jobs. We were forced to work from sunrise to 5 o'clock, and we were beaten daily if we stopped working or stopped to rest or didn't understand a word they said. We had to count off fast in Japanese each day, and our numbers changed as POWs died. One more poor old man couldn't remember his new number and was beaten almost to death. Guards screamed in our faces with bayonets and knocked us flat. I learned quite a bit of their language. I had to survive and not be beaten. There were Japanese civilians who toiled with us. The youngest one was 45. And so you know that they did hate our guts because we were submariners. Well, I worked in the pipe shop where all sizes of pipes were made. Boilers were retubed and pipe was threaded. At 10 o'clock we had a 15-minute break for a cup of green tea. At 5 p.m. we rode the train back to camp. During 1944, the first 29 bombers bombed Yawata and Kokura. Incendiary bombs landed on roofs where we worked. Man, was I scared. Bombs spit and sputtered and melted and caused many fires around us. Most of us hid or boarded a train to try and stay away. It was hell. During the bombing and hell after, there was always repercussions. Is this what we look forward to the rest of our lives? At camp each night, everyone wondered, what's for supper? Each night we would be either given a cup of rice or a cup of watery stew. After supper, we sat around talking about food and our favorite meals and our mom's cooking and what we wish we could be dining on. We prayed for Americans to come over and save us. Our wooden barracks contained 200 men. Well, maybe I'll start skipping a little bit. Bunks were 28 inches across and we slept on a tatami mat. One blanket barely covered us. Barracks weren't heated and we constantly shivered from the cold. A friend named John and I slept together, probably closer than most married couples. Bed bugs bit and lice caused constant itching. The Japanese said we brought the bugs with us, but no one who'd ever served on a submarine had problems with bugs. No one ever knew where they came from, but we picked lice and bugs off, dropped them in the fire, and loved hearing them sizzle and pop. The only time I was warm was when I bathed in 3 inches of scum-filled water after 3,460 prisoners had bathed in the same tub. The only American officer was a Navy doctor who treated us with charcoal, one of the few medicines he had. There were many Marines, Army, and British prisoners in our camp. I refused to go to sick hall because I feared I'd never live. Thousands died from lack of medicine and food and rashes. We ate about 700 calories a day and then it was cut to 500. We ate millet, horse food, which was added to the rice, which caused dysentery and weight loss. We looked like skeletons and hardly had enough energy to work. But the local townspeople starved also as the war went on. After the war, we found a room filled with Red Cross medical packages. Thousands had died who never received medical help. Red Cross food for us had been hoarded by the Japanese. We divided it with 7 other prisoners once in 2.5 years. German POWs regularly received Red Cross packages and medications. Germans only killed 1% of their POWs. Japanese killed 40%. Please read The Scarlet Camera, it's up there, by Terence Kirk. He bunked with me, and he was one of the lucky ones who had some clothes when he arrived. They were part of an embassy group in China. Okay, he constructed a cardboard man-made camera and photographed the starvation, abuse, diseases, and atrocities that the POWs received. And then they had to sign, all the prisoners of war had to sign a gag order before they could be returned to the United States that they would not reveal for 38 years how they were treated, or they would not be allowed to return to America, which I didn't realize. We only survived because Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed. They saved our lives and millions of others. The next day we lined up and the Jap major told us the war was over. When we realized it was over, we were ecstatic. Hi. Men were crying. Army senior officers and British officers started arguing about ranks. Well, Virginia, is there a chair back yonder anywhere?
Okay.
I'll grab another.
Maybe remove that poster from that one. Yeah. Her name's Virginia, everybody. Say hi. I'm glad you could come. Okay, several weeks we were, let's see, okay, this is the end of the war. After the second bomb bop, we didn't work, and that day we were told why. The next day we lined up, and they were told the war was finally over. Some beautiful planes, B-29s, flew over a day or so later and dropped 50-gallon drums filled with army clothes, shoes, hats, cigarettes, and plenty of rations. It was so good. I ate too much and immediately was sick. Notices were dropped which told us to stay put and we would be processed. We were showered with real hot water and we ate real food. It was too much food because we all swelled up and then we threw up. We were then dumped in a tank to remove our lice before we boarded any hospital ships home. The loveliest sight I saw in years were some good-looking nurses gazing over the rail. I hadn't seen an American woman since 1943, and this was 1945. Several weeks later, we were in a Guam hospital being debriefed and recuperating from beriberi, scurvy, dysentery, and rashes. I was interviewed about POW life again. We ate all the food we wanted, and we even drank some beer. And it was like eating candy, we couldn't get enough. Finally, we were going home. You know, we took a damn slow armed transport home. It seemed to take forever. All aboard were soldiers, and except for 4 Navy guys. The loveliest sight in the world I'll ever never forget was arriving in San Francisco. The last time I saw the Golden Gate Bridge was when I left in 1941. Sent to Oak Knoll Navy Hospital, Oakland, we were checked over and given our medical and had to repeat our POW history again. Back pay was collected. A wave friend drove my friend Charles and I to a bar, and I realized for the first time women were a part of the military service. Back pay was in our wallets. My friend drank too much, passed out, and when he awoke, guess what? His wallet was gone. They'd also taken his watch and ring, and I loaned him money until the next payday. It took him a couple years to repay me, but it did. Okay, I think I'm not going to continue with the rest of this, but let's see. Okay, I'll just complete this because it's 4 more pages. Now Charles retrieves his grandchildren from school, takes them to after-school activities. Yearly, he visits his sisters and brother in upstate New York. He's VFW, sub-vets, and Fleet Reserve member, and a guest speaker on Veterans Day and Memorial Day observances. Frequently, he shares his POW experiences with high school students. Each year, he attends submarine veterans of World War II reunions and keeps in touch. He was presented with a big hug and an American flag. He was my 83rd interview. Okay, what time is it? Oh. I'll allow probably the last 5 minutes for questions, and if you have any. I'd like to share one more, if you have any, one more story with you. Irene Massey Robinson's her name. Born in Sawyers Creek, California, Irene had 4 sisters, 2 brothers. Her grandfather was a gold rush miner who constructed, she was civil service at Rosie, who constructed the hotel she was born in. Her granddad, father, and mother operated it. Attired in a colorful blue and purple flowered blouse, she wore blue jeans, her blue eyes twinkled. Her white hair was short, wavy, and carefree. Because she delivered mail for 40 years, amazingly, her blood pressure is only 120/68. Don't we wish we had that one? Anyway, May 27th, 2005, this lady, who was 83, mail carrier, retired from the United States Post Office. She received congratulatory letters from all over the United States and the Virgin Islands. Irene had just returned from Sawyer's Bar, where she spent Memorial Day cleaning 3 generations of her family's graves in this Catholic cemetery. My great-grandfather was a fur trapper. My father carried 90 pounds of mail in a knapsack by mule train across the mountains during the gold rush days. During winter snowfalls, the pack train mules and horses wore wooden snowshoes, and they waddled like ducks. There were relay stations along the route. Later, he served in World War I. My dad and my granddad built a hotel where we lived and where my brothers and sisters were born. They and Mom ran it until a fire destroyed it in 1956. I attended a one-room school with 25 to 30 pupils. The girls' outhouse was up the hill to the left and the boys up the hill to the right. Hide and seek was our favorite game, and sometimes we played in the nearby Chinese graveyard. At Murderer's Gulch, Chinese miners were disliked by the whites who stole their gold and killed them. That cemetery doesn't exist anymore, she said. All the wooden markers are gone. I graduated at 16 from high school in Etna, California, which has miles and miles of placer mining. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, we were all horrified. I remember hearing President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech on the radio. My dad was a KP helper on a ranch, which didn't last long. Next, I took secretarial training at Heels Business College. Then I worked for a San Francisco insurance company. En route to visit my grandmother up north, I met my future husband on the Greyhound bus. I met Noel Massey, my future husband, on that trip. We spent one day together and then parted, and he asked me to write to him. He was going to Seattle to work at Boeing Aircraft. The year was 1943. We wrote, and finally we married, and he was hired by the Navy as an aircraft mechanic at Ford Island, Hawaii. He went separately and applied for civil service housing. He worked on planes and hangars on Ford Island, and he ferried to Pearl Harbor every day. I traveled on a Matson line converted freighter called the Philippe. 6 passengers slept in a room, and bunks 3 feet high, stacked, had been erected. During one horrible storm, everyone was seasick, and people were constantly throwing up below deck and above the deck. Everyone was seasick all day long. I wasn't seasick at all. I was lucky. Because of dehydration, many had to have IVs inserted. During one storm, portholes were tightened down, gigantic waves slammed the ship. A seaman was injured on his torso, not in the middle, fortunately. Blackout conditions were necessary. We zigged and zagged all the way across the Pacific for 11 days. I saw flying fish and dolphins for the first time. Several times we encountered floating mines. A Marine squadron could fire at and blow you to pieces. Once when I was in the laundry room, I heard a big thud from a mine. Food was good, but we played cards most of the time and chatted. And I made many good friends on that trip, but most of them have passed away. I obtained a civil service job as a Navy payroll clerk on Ford Island from September 44 to March 45. Workers boarded military cattle cars, as we called them, which were flatbed trucks. Could you open the door, please? Mm-hmm. Thank you. With canopies over the top. Get some air in here. Okay. Whew. They were towed open, which wasn't too bad as the weather was decent. Bench seats were hard, thanks, and rides bumpy. We unloaded and boarded a ferry from the main island to Ford Island. We took our lunches and worked 10-hour days. My husband worked 12. A payroll clerk totaled lists for boilermakers, janitors, and utility workers. Some of those worked 20 hours on, 20 hours off. Basically, I sat in an office, punched machines, and used a comptometer, which I had learned at Heels. Irene was my boss's name. Above her was crew leader and foreman. Damage was horrendous at Hickam Field and Wahiawa, where Wheeler was. Daily we passed the USS Arizona and other ships. If I close my eyes, I can still see the horrible sights of burned bodies, and the stench was sickening. We had to stand downwind when we approached them. You know, a Jap sub rammed an American ship and then rammed the lifeboats carrying its survivors. They treated POWs cruelly. Captured men worked as slaves, were beaten and starved. Hundreds of Korean women were kidnapped and used as sex slaves for years. Because I was pregnant with our first son, I was discharged. One of our Korean neighbors who lived near us in pidgin English, "When da baby coming out?" she asked. Bob was born at Queen's Hospital in Honolulu. Our neighbors were great people. We picnicked together up and down the block. I attended a Chinese wedding and enjoyed the mixture and learned to cook different foods. Scenery was lovely, and I loved the casualness of the islands. Once a violent storm hit. Cars flooded, houses were evacuated, and we had 24 inches of rain in 12 hours. When we lived in Kaneohe, we had 12 inches of rain in 24 hours, and we had to evacuate too. People here don't know what a real rainfall is. In 46 or 47, a tidal wave hit the area close to the blowhole. Houses from above the highway were washed away. Have you ever seen an upside down waterfall? Have you, anyone? I have in Kaneohe. Okay, I did several times on the Pali side of the mountain, where winds blew so hard the falling water was blown upwards. Our son Bob had the measles. The doctor prescribed salt water swims. When I was a kid, we couldn't take baths, wash our hair, visit others until we were better. He was 9 months home when we went home for our first visit to the United States on the USS Macedonia. 1948, we left Hawaii and moved to Hayward and then to Concord. See that gigantic orange tree in my backyard? We planted that 48 years ago. At the time, I worked as a babysitter. My husband was an aircraft mechanic at Alameda Air until he had a heart attack. Afterwards, I drove a school bus and then took the civil service test. I began working for the post office, November 26, 1965. They count my Pearl Harbor civil service time as toward my retirement. My brother served as Master Sergeant 26 years in the Army. One sister retired from Forks with 47 years in the Postal Service. She was appointed by President Eisenhower. My daughter replaced her and has also been a postal worker. The monument area of Concord is where the illegals and illegal immigrants live now. Prostitutes, solicit, and drug deals go down. It's a regular Peyton place. When I queried my mail carrier janitor to see if there was a civil service employee, she described Irene's beat. Quote, "I subbed for her route one day," she said, "and I was scared to death. I constantly looked over my shoulder. Once Irene tripped and fell over a curb. The next day, some drug dealers that she'd known said they'd beat up and take care of whoever beat her up. I never had any problems with people there," she said, "and everyone looked out for me." Well, she was 83 when she retired. She says, "Since my clients were immigrants, I learned to pronounce foreign names. I climbed 3-story apartment stairs to deliver mail and registered letters and help translate. Many asked me IRS questions. I complained to one apartment building landlord that the mailboxes were too small for their mail. I stopped delivering mail for 1 week. And when the welfare checks didn't arrive and he couldn't be paid, he replaced the mailboxes." Okay, I'll just finish her last paragraph. "Retirement will be an adjustment," she said. "She's used to rising before dawn, and now instead of breaking up kids' fights, she watches hummingbirds fighting in her backyard and tends to her garden. This delightful lady was hugged and thanked for her World War II civil service and her 40 years of carrying the U.S. mail. She was presented a flag. She patriotically and proudly served her country then and now." She was my 75th interview. And I could continue and continue. These were just part of the 47 Concord interviews for Concord. And I wish I had more time, I guess. Are there any oh, it feels good. Any questions? Okay, are there, oh, I know there's questions. Yes.
Can I offer a short testimonial and thank you to this wonderful woman, Pat?
Oh.
It's my understanding, everyone, that Pat, when I first met her, had already interviewed and then was retired from interviewing over 115 World War II veterans.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It was at that moment that she said, "Well, I'm retired because I wanted to know about my father's World War II experience. He suffered a stroke." But she told me everything I needed to know. She gave me all the booklets, she gave me the information, so I convey that to you now. I was able to complete my interview process, video process, and photographs and things that she has been sharing with you about the ones that she interviewed. I did for myself, for my dad. It took about 2 years. And after we finished, we were able to submit it to the Library of Congress. It's called the Veterans History Project.
There's brochures on the table.
I convey it all to you, that if you go to www.loc.gov, you can find out about maybe some of your beloved World War II veterans' histories, including my own father's, William K. Miney, that served in the Navy in World War II in the Pacific Front. Luckily, after all the terrible battles had been fought and many had lost their lives, was doing most of the cleanup work after, and then witnessed Hirohito surrendering to Douglas MacArthur on the deck of the USS Missouri in 1945. Well, we want to thank
Oh, you're
Pat
welcome.
Everette. She's
You're
a
welcome.
wonderful devoted almost her whole life to doing this.
No, only for
Wonderful
15 years.
service.
15 years.
She did so
Oh, thank
much, so thank you,
Oh,
Pat.
you're welcome.
Thank you,
You're
thank
welcome.
you,
Yeah.
thank you.
And please look at some of the information I have. There's a sign-up sheet here, make sure your name is on it. There's also a critique sheet. I guess I have to be critiqued, but if you ever want me to do it again, I'll be happy to return.
Yeah.
I still have Clayton and Walnut Creek and Martinez and Orinda and 3
Yeah.
over in Napa.
Many wonderful
Yeah,
stories.
so thank you for coming. And you're welcome. You're welcome. It was a labor of love.
Great lady.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's what, 4 or 5?